What you're watching is not just another missile story. It is not just Iran. It is not just Turkey. It is not just NATO. And it is definitely not just one dangerous night over the eastern Mediterranean. Because when a ballistic missile enters the airspace of a NATO member and gets shot down near one of the most sensitive military zones in the region, the real question is not whether that missile landed. The real question is this: what kind of world produces that moment in the first place? And the answer is simple, brutal, and bigger than the headline. It is the world that always appears right before a larger reckoning. A world of too many promises, too many fronts, too much debt, too much military architecture, and too little room for error. Reuters reported that NATO increased its missile defense posture after an Iranian ballistic missile entered Turkish airspace and was intercepted near Hatay, close to Incirlik, while global debt had already climbed to a record $348 trillion by the end of 2025. Those two facts may seem unrelated. They are not. One is a military signal, the other is a stress signal. Put them together and you get the same pattern history always produces before systems lose their balance. That is the point most people miss. Wars do not widen only because someone wants war. They widen because systems become too fragile to absorb shocks, because alliances become too public to ignore, because rival powers stop testing each other with words and start testing each other with hardware, because credibility becomes more valuable than caution. And once that happens, events no longer stay local. They travel. They travel through bases, through shipping lanes, through oil prices, through bond markets, through political narratives, through fear. That is why this moment matters. Not because one missile changes the world overnight, but because one missile can reveal that the world was already changing underneath us. And history has a formula for moments like this. It always starts with the setup. This is the stage where great powers build structures they call stabilizing. Bases, missile shields, defense treaties, forward deployments, proxy networks, sanctions regimes, strategic corridors, lines on maps, red lines in speeches. The public is told these structures prevent war. But what they really do is organize future conflict. They decide where the pressure will build. They decide which locations become sacred. They decide which airspaces become intolerable to violate. They decide which assets become too important to lose. Then comes expansion. This is where the system grows beyond clean control. More commitments, more guarantees, more enemies, more dependencies, more pressure on budgets, more confidence that deterrence still works, more belief that the other side will stop one step before the edge. This is the most deceptive stage because everything still looks manageable. Markets are open. Leaders speak calmly. Officials call the situation contained. The map still looks familiar. But underneath, the number of possible failure points keeps rising. Then comes crisis. One strike, one border violation, one misread signal, one assassination, one blockade, one missile. One event that forces the system to answer the question it has been avoiding for years. Are your red lines real, or were they only useful until someone tested them? And then comes the outcome. At that point, the system does not return to innocence. It does not go back to the old equilibrium. It adapts under pressure. Maybe it escalates, maybe it reinforces, maybe it retreats in one place and hardens in another. Maybe it survives the shock, but even survival changes behavior. Because once a line has been tested live, everyone updates. Allies update, enemies update, markets update, generals update, presidents update. That is the machine. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome, different centuries, different empires, same structure. Look at Europe before World War I. Most people reduce that catastrophe to one gunman in Sarajevo. That is why most people never see the real lesson. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not create the danger. It activated a structure that had been built for decades. The setup was already there. Germany tied to Austria, Hungary, France tied to Russia, Britain drifting into Entente commitments, mobilization plans written around speed, rail systems designed for mass war, military doctrine built on the belief that hesitation meant defeat. Europe called that balance. It was not balance. It was a continental tripwire. Then came expansion. Austria pushed. Germany backed it. Russia leaned toward Serbia. France was locked in. Britain stayed just ambiguous enough to encourage miscalculation and just committed enough to be dragged in when Belgium was violated. That is what expansion really looks like. Not chaos, overconfidence. Everyone believed they could move fast without losing control. Everyone believed mobilization could pressure the other side without making general war unavoidable. Everyone believed credibility could be defended without paying the full price. Then came crisis. The July ultimatums, the mobilizations, the invasion routes, the point where every government stopped asking, what keeps peace? And started asking, what happens if we blink first? That shift is fatal. Because once credibility becomes the center of decision-making, restraint starts to look like weakness. And once restraint looks like weakness inside an alliance system, the machine begins to move by itself. Then came the outcome: industrial slaughter, imperial collapse, revolution, financial exhaustion, a generation erased, not accidental, systemic. Now jump to the Pacific. Again, people remember the explosion. They forget the architecture. The setup was imperial control across East Asia and the Pacific. Japan expanding through Korea and Manchuria. The United States protecting maritime access. European colonial powers defending their own holdings. Oil, steel, sea lanes, islands, and prestige tied together into one strategic map. Then came expansion. Japan kept moving. China became a wider war. French Indochina became another step. And the United States answered not first with invasion, but with pressure, restrictions, asset freezes, oil constraints. This is important. Expansion is not always tanks crossing borders. Sometimes expansion is a system tightening around a state until every option becomes worse than the last one. That is what happened. Japan grew more aggressive. America grew more restrictive. The system became binary. Then came crisis. Pearl Harbor was not born on one morning in December. It was the violent answer of a power that had already overextended and saw its room to maneuver collapsing. It was still a choice, but it was a choice made inside a narrowing structure. Then came the outcome: total war, mass mobilization, collapse of the Japanese Empire, a new American security architecture in Asia. Again, same machine. Now look at the Gulf in 1990. The setup? A region built around oil choke points, external guarantees, monarchy survival, and heavy outside military interest. The expansion? Iraq, emerging from the Iran-Iraq war, indebted, militarized, and unable to convert wartime structure back into peacetime stability. Pressure with Kuwait rising. Signals getting mixed. Confidence staying irrationally high. Then crisis. The invasion of Kuwait. And that single act immediately stopped being only about Kuwait. It became about oil flow, American credibility, regional order, the meaning of post-Cold War power. That is how you know you are in stage 3. One event suddenly carries 5 strategic meanings at once. Then outcome: Desert Storm. Long-term U.S. military deepening in the Gulf. Sanctions. No-fly zones. Future wars built into the aftermath of the first one. Now bring that pattern back to the present. The setup is obvious. For decades, the United States and its allies built a layered military structure across the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. Air bases, naval presence, missile defense, intelligence networks, sanctions tools, partner armies, and forward deterrence. Turkey is not a side detail in that structure. Turkey is NATO territory. And Incirlik is not just another installation. It is one of the most sensitive nodes in the region, long linked to U.S. operations and widely reported to store U.S. nuclear weapons. The architecture is already there. The tripwire already exists. Then came expansion. Iran built missile depth and regional reach. Proxy networks expanded. The U.S. kept commitments in the Middle East, while also carrying strategic burdens in Europe and Asia. Sanctions intensified. Deterrence signaling multiplied. The map filled with more pressure points than the system could cleanly manage. And all of this unfolded inside an economic order already stretched thin. That matters. Because high-debt systems do not absorb geopolitical shocks gracefully, they transmit them. According to Reuters, global debt reached $348 trillion by the end of 2025, up about $29 trillion in a single year. That is not background noise. That is the financial measure of a world with less margin for military error. Then came crisis. Reuters reported that an Iranian ballistic missile entered Turkish airspace and was intercepted by NATO-linked defenses near Hatay, with debris falling near the area of Incirlik. Reuters also reported that NATO then raised its missile defense posture, while Secretary General Mark Rutte said Article 5 was not being discussed. Read that carefully, because that is the exact language of a system under live stress, serious enough to reinforce, not yet ready to widen, determined to project control, unwilling to admit how close the boundary has come to being tested. And this is where shallow analysis fails, because people hear the missile was intercepted, and they think that means stability won. But sometimes a successful intercept does not reduce danger. Sometimes it increases it. Why? Because now the threshold is real. Now every actor has seen the line under live conditions. Now adversaries know what gets answered. Now allies know what must be answered. Now planners know how fast the system reacts. Now the abstract has become operational. That is not the end of the danger. That is the beginning of the next calculation. And this is the most important point in the entire script. Systems do not become safer simply because the first shock was survived. In fact, history often becomes more dangerous after the first successful containment, because elites confuse survival with control, because the public calms down, because markets reprice only partially, because leaders begin to believe the machine is still manageable. But the machine is not calmer. It is simply more informed. Now everyone knows the contact point is real. That changes behavior. NATO will think differently. Turkey will think differently. Iran will think differently. Regional governments will think differently. Markets will think differently about shipping, energy, insurance, and escalation risk. And once everyone updates at the same time, the old equilibrium is already gone. That is why this is bigger than one military incident. This is about credibility economics. Empires run on belief. Belief that the alliance means what it says. Belief that bases are defensible. Belief that escalation can be managed. Belief that deterrence still deters. Belief that a state burdened by debt, elections, inflation, and global commitments can still project firmness everywhere at once. When that belief weakens, risk rises from both directions. Adversaries get bolder. Allies get nervous. And both of those reactions make the system more unstable. That is the hidden mechanism, not simply missiles, confidence. That is why the phrase, "this time is different," is so dangerous. This time is different because the leaders are smarter. This time is different because the missile defenses are stronger. This time is different because the economy is too interconnected for major escalation. This time is different because nobody wants a wider war. This time is different because technology will prevent catastrophic miscalculation. History has heard all of this before, and history keeps answering the same way. Intentions do not control systems once structures become overloaded. A systemic crisis does not require leaders to want disaster. It only requires them to operate inside a structure where every option carries rising political, military, and symbolic cost. That is when rational actors begin producing irrational outcomes. Not because they are insane, because they are trapped. And no, modern power does not cancel that pattern. Not American power, not NATO power, not financial power, not technological power. Superior force can delay consequences. It can shape them, it can redirect them, but it cannot repeal geography. It cannot repeal overextension. It cannot repeal the logic of credibility under stress. So what should the viewer take from this? Stop watching geopolitics as isolated episodes. That is how audiences get manipulated by headlines. One airstrike, one speech, one emergency summit, one market dip, one missile. It all looks random when consumed in fragments. It becomes clear when you watch the pattern. Study structure, not drama. Watch bases, corridors, alliances, debt, fuel routes, production capacity, and forward deployments. Those are the bones of the story. The headlines are only the skin. And most of all, remember this. The most dangerous moment is often not the explosion. It is the period right after when everyone says the situation has been contained, because that is the moment when the system starts adapting for the next test. That is where we are now. Not at the end, at the threshold. A missile entered the airspace of a NATO member. It was intercepted near one of the most sensitive strategic zones in the region. NATO raised its missile defense posture. Article 5 was not invoked. The official message is control. But the structural message is different. The boundary has been tested. The line has been illuminated. The machine has made contact with reality. And once that happens, the burden of proof changes. Now it is no longer enough to say, calm down. Now it is no longer enough to say, nobody wants war. Now it is no longer enough to say, technology will handle it. Now the real question is whether this system, unlike every overloaded system before it, can somehow escape the pattern that consumed the others. It probably cannot. That does not mean tomorrow is world war. It means the age of easy assumptions is over. It means more tests are likely, more signaling, more pressure, more reinforcement, more strategic hedging, more financial sensitivity, more political theater used to conceal structural fear. And the people who do best in such moments are not always the loudest. They are the clearest, the ones who understand what stage they are in, the ones who see that what looks sudden is usually the final expression of something built slowly, the ones who refuse to be comforted by language when the structure is telling a different story. That is the warning here. Not that one missile changes everything, but that one missile can expose that everything was already changing. And if you want to understand what happens next, how this machine was built, why it keeps generating the same pattern, and what the next stage looks like before the mainstream narrative catches up, then stay here. Subscribe now. Because the next video is not just about the next headline. It is about the architecture underneath the headline. And once you see that architecture clearly, you will never watch these events the same way again.